As much as I love this movie, this is kind of annoying. This is the third time I've had to redo this video because number one wasn't my fault. I was interrupted by a phone call. Again, not my fault, but you know. And then secondly, I messed up a part, so gotta retry it again. And as much as I love this movie, hopefully this is the final time I have to reshoot and try to redo this review. But it is what it is. So yeah, but enough of that long-winded intro. But hey there, guys, this is Cole. Welcome back to another Christmas movie review for the month of December. And today's Christmas movie I'm going to be reviewing, as you can tell by the title of today's video, is the 1988 Christmas action movie Die Hard, starring Bruce Willis and directed by John McTiernan, which I own in this DVD case here. But yeah. So what is the plot to this movie for those who have never heard of Die Hard? Well, the plot of this movie is as follows. New York City policeman John McClane, played by Bruce Willis, is visiting his estranged wife, Holly McClane, played by Bonnie Bedelia, and two daughters on Christmas Eve. He joins her at a holiday party in the headquarters of the Japanese-owned business she works for, but the festivals are interrupted by a group of terrorists who take over the exclusive high-rise and everyone in it. Soon, John McClane realizes that there's no one to save the hostages but himself. So that's basically the simple plot synopsis to this movie, Die Hard, and I'm sure most people have seen this movie, and even people who haven't seen this, this is such a well-known, recognized movie that even people who haven't seen this movie know what Die Hard is. I mean, that's how big of a name brand it is. But anyways, so before I get into my review and my thoughts on the movie, I want to talk about some trivia on how this movie was made and, you know, of course, get into the review after that. But anyways, how was this movie made? Well, in 1987, after the success John McTiernan had directing the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie Predator, which came out that year, he was hired by 20th Century Fox to direct a movie adaptation of the 1979 book Nothing Lasts Forever. Filming took place at Fox Plaza in LA City from late 1987 to early 1988. However, John McTiernan decided to title the movie Die Hard as he thought that was a better title, which I would happen to agree with him there. And now, how was this movie received? Well, when this movie was released on July 15th, 1988, it received positive reviews from critics and audiences, making $143.7 million worldwide against a budget of only $28 million. And Die Hard is widely regarded as one of the best action movies of all time by both critics and audiences, and it has been described. Now, I know for years this movie's been debated if it's a Christmas movie or not. I personally think that I'm going to say this right now, and I'm sorry, I do not care if this upsets people, but I think that whole debate is very stupid, okay? Like, number one, the movie takes place on Christmas, and number two, it's at a Christmas party. And yes, I know that this is not a Christmas movie in the traditional sense, and essentially what I mean by the traditional sense is like a family Christmas movie, like a comedy. Like, it's like, okay, it's not that type of Christmas movie, but it's still a Christmas movie. But I don't know, that's just the way I see it, but I'm not going to get into all of that. That's a whole nother topic, whole nother video, whole nother discussion, whole nother day. So let's actually, you know, get into talking about the movie. But as for my reaction to the movie, yeah, Die Hard is not only my favorite action movie of all time, it's just one of my favorite movies of all time in general. If any of you guys watching somehow have not seen this movie, stop watching this video right now and go check out this movie, because you are missing out on a classic if you have not seen this movie. You really are. But and also, if any of you guys use Prime Video, the movie is currently free on there. So check this movie out if you haven't seen it. And like I said, the movie takes place on Christmas. So with it being the December season, now would be the perfect time to watch this movie. But yeah, enough of that long-winded intro. Let's actually get into the review of the movie. So the movie starts off where John McClane, aka the main character played by Bruce Willis, is sitting next to his partner on an airplane, and his partner says, "You don't like flying, do you?" And then John McClane says, "I did at my last job." And then John McClane gets off the airplane, to go to where he has to go. And we then cut to a scene at the Nakatomi Plaza, which is the headquarters of the Japanese-owned business that John McClane's wife, Holly McClane, owns. Holly calls her daughter, Lucy, on the phone and says, "Hello, Lucy McClane, this is your mother calling." And then Lucy asks, "Mommy, when are you coming home?" And Holly says, "Pretty soon, but you'll be in bed when I get there, though. Let me talk to Paulino, okay?" And then Lucy asks, "Is Daddy coming home soon?" And then Holly says, "We'll see what Mommy and Santa can do, okay? Put Paulina on the phone for me, okay? Good night, honey." Paulina's the babysitter of this kid. But anyways, Holly then says, Holly basically asked the babysitter if John McClane called, and she said no. And then Holly says, "He probably just didn't have time. It may be a good idea to make a spare bedroom just in case." And Paulino says, "I already did." And then, and Holly's like, "Oh, what would I ever do without you? You're the best. I gotta go now. Bye-bye." We then cut to John McClane at the airport, who meets up with Argyle, who is meant to be John's limousine driver, because John is supposed to go to the Christmas party. And now, granted, he's not the main focus of the movie, but I do like Argyle as a character in this movie. I think he's a very funny character. And also, fun fact, the cinematography in this movie was actually done by John DeBont, who, after this movie, would go on to direct the 1994 classic action movie Speed with Keanu Reeves, which that was the directorial debut of John DeBont, which that is another great movie. Love that movie. He also did Twister, which I like, but then after that, his career went downhill as a director. But again, back to the review, because I'm getting off track. Whole other video, whole other day. John McClane arrives at the Nakatomi Plaza for the party. Holly then walks up to John McClane's office, delighted to see John McClane at the party for Christmas. And now we cut to a scene where a security guard is watching the camera, which shows a car pulling up fast, and he sees two people that he doesn't recognize show up, and one of the men is a guy with blonde hair by the name of Carl, who is the henchman of the main villain of this movie, Hans Gruber. And Carl goes inside the building and he shoots the security guard with a silencer, which ends up shocking Theo, who is one of his partners. And Theo then says on a walkie-talkie, to the boss, Hans Gruber, "We're in." And Theo is a tech expert, but we'll get to that when we get to that. We are then introduced to the main villain of the movie, Hans Gruber, played by Alan Rickman, who's walking into the building with his men. And Hans Gruber's a really good actor, whether it's him as John McClane in this movie, or, his role in the 1999 comedy Galaxy Quest, which is a great spoof comedy on Star Trek. I also really enjoyed his role in the Western movie Quigley Down Under. He played a pretty good bad guy in that. Alan Rickman's a very solid actor. Rest in peace, Alan Rickman. We then cut to John McClane, played by Bruce Willis, who opens up his wallet and finds a note inside his wallet, and he basically finds a note inside his wallet in a mini booklet that says, "We miss you, Daddy. Love, Lucy and John," which is a very touching scene. John then calls Argyle asking how it's going, and Argyle says good, but the call is cut short as Carl and one of his partners basically cut the phone wires. So, he can't, so basically you can't call anyone in the building unless it's on a walkie-talkie. But Anyways, well, that'll play a part later on that we'll get to. We then cut to a scene where Hans Gruber and his men walk out of the elevator and start shooting up the place, making people panic. And while this is going on, John McClane is upstairs and he hears the commotion, and John McClane peeks out the door and sees this, so he runs up a few flight of stairs barefoot and, out of sight from the enemy. We then cut to Hans Gruber, who says, "Ladies and gentlemen, due to the Nakatomi's corporation's legacy of being around the globe, there ought to be a lesson in the real use of power. You will be witnesses. Now, where is Joseph?" And Joseph is the guy, of course, in charge of the building. And then they take Joseph hostage. And then we cut to a scene where Joseph is being held hostage by Hans Gruber, and Hans Gruber says, "I need the code." He says to Joseph, "I need the code key because I am interested in the $640 million in the Gushable Barabods locked in your vault. And the computer controls the vault." But then Joseph says to him, "You want money? What kind of a terrorist are you?" And then Hans then laughs and says, "Who says we are terrorists?" And then John McClane sneaks to an area out of sight to spy on the conversation. And Hans Gruber says, "The code, please." And then Joseph says, "There's 7 safe codes in our vault, and the key code is only one of them. You'll never get it open." And then Hans Gruber says, "Then there's no reason not to tell it to us." And then Theo says, "I told you." And then Hans Gruber then says, "That's a very nice suit, Joseph. It would be a shame to ruin it. I am going to count to 3, and there will not be a 4. And then Joseph says, "You're just going to have to kill me then." And then Hans Gruber does, as Joseph says. And in that scene right there, the whole scene where John McClane witnesses Joseph, the owner, being shot is a rather intense scene. Carl, the main henchman of Hans Gruber, gets suspicious, thinking someone may be watching them. And after Carl leaves the room John is hiding in, John McClane says, "Argyle, please tell me you've heard the gunshot and you have called the police." We then cut to Argyle sitting, jamming the loud music in the limo, so obviously he didn't hear it. Hans Gruber then wants Theo to unlock the safe, and Theo says everything is able to be opened except the 7th lock. Hans Gruber then says, "Call 911, give them the guard's name, the building code number, and cancel the alarm, then disable the system." And then Hans Gruber basically asks Eddie, "On what floor did the alarm go off?" And then Carl says it was floor 9. We then cut to a scene where Tony, one of Hans' henchmen, is upstairs searching for John McClane. Tony then says, "The fire has been called off, my friend. Nobody is coming to help you. You might as well come out and join the others. I promise I won't hurt you." And then of course there's the whole scene where John McClane distracts him by turning on a buzzsaw. Then John McClane says, Drop it, D-I-C-K head. This is the police." And then Tony says, "You won't hurt me." And then John McClane says, "Oh yeah? Why not?" And then Tony says, "Because you're a policeman. There are rules for policemen." And then I love the part when John McClane grabs a hold of him and then says, "Yeah, that's what my captain keeps telling me." And then he punches Tony and grabs a hold of him while Tony is firing off his AK-47. Then they fight until the door busts down, and then John McClane falls down the stairs with Tony, resulting in Tony dying, but obviously John McClane survives. I love the part, and this leads to one of my favorite scenes in the movie. I love the whole scene. I love the scene where after the death of Johnny, his body is sitting in a chair tied to it, and the chair is inside of an elevator, and the elevator door opens up on the 1st floor, and there is writing on Tony's shirt that says, "Now I have a machine gun. Ho, ho, ho." Like I really liked that. Like, that was creative. And then Hans Gruber reads it off, kind of amused and stuff. And Tony just so happens to be Carl's brother. So obviously now Carl wants to get revenge on John McClane wants to avenge his brother Tony. And anyways, John McClane goes to the top of the roof basically using a walkie-talkie, and he says, terrorists have taken over the Nakatomi Plaza, and there's a bunch of hostages. Anyone there, while using a walkie-talkie. And Hans Gruber orders Carl to go to the top of the roof to stop John McClane. We then cut to a female police officer dispatcher who basically says it's the same address as the fire signal, and then one officer says, I'll handle it. And the officer who says, I'll handle it, then says to John McClane, in these exact words, attention, whoever you are, this channel is reserved for emergencies only. And then I absolutely love the part when John McClane says, no effing SHIT, lady. Does it look like I'm ordering a pizza? Like, I thought that line was funny. And then John McClane says, they have already killed one hostage. They're fortifying their positions while you're jerking me off on the radio. Now send me police back up ASAP. The officer then says to John, sir, I've already told you this channel is reserved. And she says, if this is an emergency, dial 911 on your telephone. Otherwise, I'm going to have to report this as an FCC violation. And then John McClane says, fine, report me. Come down here and arrest me. Just send the police now. And then John McClane stops the call as Carl and the other bad guys are firing AK-47s at him. And the dispatcher hears gunfire in the call, making her kind of wonder, like, what's really going on. At the 45-minute mark of the movie, we finally cut to a character by the name of Sergeant Powell, who is who is at a gas station buying food, and he is called on the walkie-talkie to investigate a Code 2 at the Nakatomi Plaza, Century City. And then Sergeant Powell then says he's on his way. And I gotta say, the whole scene where John uses an AK-47 on an open vent, now this entire scene right here, basically John McClane, he puts an AK-47 in between a wall, but it's like this wall with like a hole by it, but basically the idea is it'll hold him up, and he's basically has like the gun rope, tied to him so he can go down it slowly, and he uses that by an open vent that leads to a large hole, but John McClane uses the AK-47 strap to go down slowly to reach another event, to basically reach another vent on another wall. Is a rather intense scene as John McClane falls down 20 feet and grabs a hole vent on the side and crawls in it for safety. And that's a rather well done, intense scene as the bad guys hear it and they're trying to figure out where he's at. Sergeant Powell then arrives and goes inside the building, then talking to one of the Sergeant Powell goes inside and he's talking to one of the terrorists who he has no idea that it's a terrorist. He thinks it's just a security guard. And he tells Sergeant Powell he can look around, and I love the part when John McClane is fighting one of the terrorists, and one of the terrorists says, next time you have a chance to kill someone, don't hesitate. Then John McClane shoots the guy under the table and says, thanks for the advice. And then Sergeant Powell was like, oh, forget this. So he gives up, and he's about to walk out of the building, and he says, sorry for wasting your time. And as soon as Sergeant Powell gets into his car, John McClane throws a body on top of the car to get his attention, breaking the glass, and then, which obviously, freaks out Sergeant Powell. And then Henrich and Marco, two of Hans Gruber's men, open fire wildly at Powell's car, but they're not trying to stop him from leaving, but they're not trying to kill him at the moment either. Then Sergeant Powell backs up his car, and it tips up in the air against the wall, after it falls down part of a hill. It's not like a big hill, it's only like a 6-foot hill, but you get the idea. And then he calls on the walkie-talkie, I need assistance now. And now let's get to this. Now, I love the whole scene when John McClane, I love the whole part when John McClane is using a walkie-talkie Sorry about that. I had to answer a message, but I had to pause this video quick. But getting back to the part I was talking about, I love the part when John McClane is using a walkie-talkie to talk to Hans Gruber, and Hans Gruber says, "Who are you?" And then John McClane says, "Just a fly in the ointment hairs. Just a fly in the ointment hairs, a monkey in the wrench, a pain in the ass." Very good line of dialogue delivered by Bruce Willis. Hans Gruber then says, "Mystery guest, are you still there?" And then John McClane says, "Yeah, I'm still here, unless you want me to open up the front door for me." And then Hans Gruber says, "No, I'm afraid not. But you have me at a loss. You know my name, but who are you? But who are you? Just an American who saw way too many movies as a child. Another orphan of the bankrupt culture who thinks he's John Wayne, Rambo, Martian Dillon." And then John McClane replies to him, "I was always kind of partial to Roy Rogers, actually. And I was actually partial to Roy Rogers, actually. I really like those sequined shirts." And then Hans Gruber says, "Do you really think..." Sorry, another message I had to answer, but I love the whole part when John McClane says, "Do you really think you have a chance against us, Mr. Cowboy?" And then I love the part when John McClane says, "Yippee-ki-yay, mother F-worder." You know, a very, very good iconic line of dialogue. Then he hangs up the phone. Then he hangs up the walkie-talkie on Hans Gruber. The cops show up, and Sergeant Powell asks for the guy on the radio if he reads, which he does, and John, because he doesn't want to give away his real name in case the bad guys are listening, uses a fake name by the name of Roy. He says, "Call me Roy," when talking to Sergeant Powell, and he tells Sergeant Powell that there are 30 hostages on floor 30, and the deputy police chief is talking to Sergeant Powell saying, "What's the deal here?" And Sergeant Powell says, "If you mean the terrorists, we don't exactly know what they want. Sergeant Powell says, 'Is this that guy you've been talking to?' But basically after John McClane is done talking to him, the deputy police chief is talking to Sergeant Powell. He says, 'What's the deal here?' Sergeant Powell then says, 'If you mean terrorists, we don't exactly know what they want. We haven't heard a peep from them.' The deputy police chief says, 'Who have you been talking to?' And then Sergeant Powell says, 'We don't know that either, sir. He won't give us a name. But he appears to be the one who phoned in the report. He's killed one terrorist for sure, and he claims he's capped off 2 others.' And then the police chief says he has claimed, and then the police chief says to him, 'Has it ever occurred to you he could be one of the terrorists pulling your chain?' And then Sergeant Powell says, 'I don't think so. I don't think so, sir. In fact, I think he's a cop. Maybe not LAPD, but he's officially a badge. And I know that because of a bunch of things he said. It's like being able to spot a phony ID.' And then I love the part when the police chief, played by Paul Gleason, I love the part when he says, 'He could be the effing bartender for all we know.' Like, I thought that line of dialogue was funny. The police chief orders his men to go in, but Sergeant Powell tells him that he is insane as there's 30 hostages in there. And Hans Gruber tells his men to be ready as police officers are getting ready to go into the building. And I love the part when Theo says, "'Twas the night before Christmas, and all of the house, not a creature was stirring, except the 4 a-hole words coming in the rear in standard 2x2 cover formation." Then the police chief realizes sending cops to the building was a mistake, so he orders them to go back, but it's too late, as the bad guys got to them first. And I gotta say, I love the whole scene when John McClane attaches a bomb to a chair that he throws down a vent, which causes an explosion on the glass floor. And Sergeant Powell then talks to John on the walkie-talkie, asking if he's fine, which he is. But then the police chief asks Sergeant Powell if this is the guy he's been talking to, and he basically tells Sergeant Powell, "Give me that." And the police chief says to John, "Now you listen to me, mister. I don't know who you think you are, but you just destroyed a building. Now, we do not want your help. Is that clear? We do not want your help. I've got over 100 people down there covered in glass. And then I love the part when John McClane, played by Bruce Willis, says, glass? Who gives a you-know-what about glass? And then I love the part when he's like, who the F is this? Then the police chief says, this is Deputy Chief of Police Dwayne. This is Deputy Chief of Police Dwayne T. Robinson, and I am in charge of this situation. And then John says, oh, you're in charge. Well, I got some bad news for you, Dwayne. From up here, it doesn't look like you're in charge of Jack S.H. Word, which I thought that line of dialogue was funny. And then I love the part when he says, you listen to me, a-hole, and then, you know, and then, you know, John McClane replies to him, a-hole, I'm not the one who just got butt effed on national TV, Dwayne. And then we cut to a scene of Argyle in the limousine laughing at it. Like, that scene right there is very funny. And then John McClane says, now you listen to me, jerk off. If you're not a part of a solution, you're a part of the problem. Quit being a part of the problem and put the other guy back on. And then Sergeant Powell then asks, hey, Roy, how are you feeling? And then John says, pretty underappreciated. And then Sergeant Powell says, listen, there's plenty of people that like you, so hang in there. Then, of course, there's the whole scene where Harry Ellis is talking to John on the walkie-talkie, who Harry Ellis just so happens to be a longtime friend of John McClane. And you know, and he says to John McClane, listen, John, they want you to tell me where the detonators are. They know people are listening. They want the detonators or they're going to kill me. And John McClane demands Harry to put Hans Gruber back on the line, which he does. And then John yells to Harry, please, tell them you don't know me. But then Harry says, how can you say that when we've known each other for all these years? Then Hans Gruber shoots Harry. You know, so John basically lost one of his best friends. And we now cut to a scene 1 hour, 29 minutes into the movie where we are introduced to FBI Special Agent Johnson, we're introduced to FBI Agent Little Johnson and FBI Special Agent Big Johnson, who is actually played by Robert Davi. Now, for those who don't know him as an actor, he played the bad guy, Jake, in the 1985 family comedy movie, The Goonies, one of my favorite movies of all time, as well as the bad guy, Franz Sanchez, in the 1989 action movie License to Kill, the second Timothy Dalton James Bond movie, which he was in a year after this, which I absolutely love that movie, so it's nice to see him in this movie, even if it's just a small limited role. And the FBI tells the police chief that you're no longer in charge of this operation, we're in charge and we're going to take this matter into our own hands. And I gotta say, I love the part when Hans Gruber is wandering upstairs and then John McClane points an AK-47 at Hans Gruber and says, hi, how are you doing? And Hans Gruber pretends to be an innocent victim and says, oh, please God, you're one of them, aren't you? You're one of them. Please don't kill me. Please don't kill me. Please. So, and, you know, because of it, he's able to trick John McClane as John McClane, yes, he knows the guy's voice, but, like, he doesn't know, he has no idea he doesn't know exactly what Hans Gruber looks like, as, you know, they've only talked to each other on the walkie-talkie, and John McClane says, relax, I'm not gonna hurt you. John then asks, what are you doing up here, and what are you looking for? And then Hans Gruber says, I managed to get through there, and I was just trying to get up on top of the roof and see if I could signal for help. And then John McClane then says, forget it. If you want to stay alive, you stay with me. And then, of course, there's the whole scene where John McClane and Hans Gruber are smoking cigarettes, and Hans Gruber says, you don't work for Nakatomi, and if you're not one of them, and then John McClane says, I'm a cop from New York. Got invited to a Christmas party by mistake. Who knew? John McClane then says, better than being caught with your pants down, huh? And then, of course, after that, Hans Gruber and John McClane both start laughing. And then John McClane says, I'm John McClane. Who are you? And then Hans Gruber kind of gives him like a a look like he knows something's off, and then but then he decides to act in character, and then Han says Clay, Larry Clay. And then of course John McClane asks him, do you know how to use a handgun, Bill? And so because of this, John decides to give Hans Gruber a gun, and of course the main character, John McClane, walks away. Then Hans Gruber points the gun and says, put down your gun and give me my detonators. And then John McClane says, well, Hans. But when Hans Gruber uses the gun that, he made John McClane gave him, it's completely empty. And then Carl and another henchman show up, and then John McClane starts shooting an AK-47 at them, the one that Hans Gruber had initially before then. And then of course John McClane escapes, but because of an explosion, but being able to escape, he gets some glass chunks in his foot, which would not feel good at all, and he was barefoot. So I can only imagine how much that would hurt. I mean, I will say this right now. I have stepped on glass and I have stepped on thumbtacks before, and they do not feel pleasant, so I do not imagine this would be any better. But getting back to the movie, there's also other great stuff in this movie. I love the part when Holly McClane says John McClane is still alive. I love the part when she says John is still alive. Only John can drive someone that crazy. And then of course there's the whole scene where John McClane is on the rooftop and is fighting off Carl. Then of course there's the whole scene where Lucy McClane is being interviewed with news people, and they say, is there something you want to say? And then Lucy says, Daddy, come home. Then Hans Gruber figures out Holly's real name, and he shoots at the ceiling. He says, it's such a delight that you could, join us. And then, of course, he shoots a gun in the air, freaking everyone out. And then we get closer to the end of the movie where Hans Gruber is now holding John McClane's wife hostage. And John McClane is on the rooftop with everyone, warning everyone to get off the roof as the roof is detonated and it'll explode very soon. And John McClane is shooting a gun in the air to show that he's serious. However, the FBI helicopter mistakes it, and the FBI, now John McClane's a good guy, but the FBI doesn't know him, so they think he's a bad guy, and they start shooting at him. And then John McClane is able to get out of sight, and he says, I'm on your side, a-holes, and stuff like that. And then, of course, there's the whole scene where John McClane, he ties a fire hose to his waist and breaks open a glass window by sliding into it and is shooting at it. Hans Gruber then tells John to put the gun down, otherwise his wife will die. And I gotta say, I love the part when Hans Gruber says, what was it that you said to me before? Yippee-ki-yay, mother effer. And then I love the part when Hans Gruber and John McClane start laughing, and John McClane has a pistol taped to his back that he pulls off, and then he shoots Hans Gruber before Hans can do anything, as well as the henchman right next to him. And I gotta say, the ending is great, and this close to the end of the movie, especially when Hans Gruber is hanging outside of the window while holding on top of Holly McClane's wrist, and then John McClane pulls Hans Gruber's hand off the wrist, and John McClane falls to his death from a very high height from the building. Is a very iconic scene. And the whole part right there, fun fact, the whole part where Hans Gruber looks shocked when he falls, his reaction in that scene was genuine, as the director of this movie, John McTiernan, did not tell him that part was going to be in the movie, so that's really cool. I love the part, and I gotta say, I love the part near the end of the movie where Carl comes out of the building about to shoot at John McClane, but Sergeant Powell shoots at Carl, resulting in his death. The movie then, not long after that, the movie ends on a happy note where John McClane and Holly McClane happily reunite, and they get a ride in the limo, basically out of there to go home to their family for Christmas. So yeah, I know this was a long, in-depth review, but I had to make the review this long because I love this movie and I wanted to give this movie the proper review it deserved. And honestly, I don't have any bad issues with this movie whatsoever. Like, I really enjoyed this movie, and on a scale of 1 to 10, I am going to give Die Hard a perfect 10 out of 10. So yeah, anyways, guys, that was my review on Die Hard, and yeah, we'll catch you guys later. Bye-bye now.